So, hello everyone. Welcome to the McGill Effective Parenting Series 2020, Parenting in the Digital Age. I'm Adam Dubé, an assistant professor within the department and one of the organizers for this series. This is the final evening for the series this year, and we're going to be talking about youth gaming, how much is too much. Now, on behalf of McGill's Faculty of Education and the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology, I'd like to thank our media sponsor, Montreal Families, for getting the word out. And our new corporate sponsor for this masterclass, La Caisse des Jardins de l'Éducation. Their support helps us make this event free to parents and families across Canada. So a big thank you to them, and we have a brief word from them, actually.
If you work in education, you're often called on to be a guide, an example, an inspiration, a springboard, an awakening, maybe even a hero. Let us help you be it all without worrying about your financial future. At the Caisse de l'Éducation, we offer exclusive services designed for each career cycle and specific to workplace situations. We're here for you, like a guide, an example, an inspiration, a spring.
Okay, so that's everything here. So we're going to be moving on to our this evening's speaker, Dr. Derevensky.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm sorry we can't meet in person. I want to thank Dr. Dubé for organizing this series and being a speaker in the series. Also, I'd like to thank Dr. Victoria Talwer, who's our department chair and who helped support this series as well as speaking last week. I'm not going to reiterate what Dr. Dubé had talked about, nor how Dr. Talwer talked about in terms of screen time, but what I'd like to focus in today is on a slightly different component, and that is gaming. And the title that we were using was How Much is Too Much? But another way of looking at this title is Gaming, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so I will be presenting this. All these sessions have been recorded, and within my session, there are a number of slides I'm not going to have time to go over in any detail, but that Dr. Dubé has agreed to post those slides along with the recorded session so that you'll be able to have it as a reference in the future. So why talk about gaming? And I want to differentiate gaming from gambling. The gambling industry often refers to itself as gaming. Gaming is entertainment. We're talking about games, real games that you can actually play on your computer, on your smartphone, on your personal device. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about how gaming and gambling have actually merged and that there's a migration between gaming and gambling and something that parents should be aware of and should look out for. So today's youth are technologically sophisticated. They're very familiar with how to use laptops. They're very familiar how to use iPads and also smartphones. And today, as was shared in some of the previous talks, it's not unusual for our children and adolescents to have many different devices and opportunities to look at screen time. And they start fairly young. And Dr. Dubé talked a lot about some of the games and some of the apps that are useful for educating young children. And these are our teenagers today. They're hooked to their cell phones, their smartphones. They tend not to talk to each other. They tend to text each other. And they tend to use their smartphones as a way of communicating. But at the same time, these are mini computers. And you can actually play lots of the games that are being developed right on your smartphone. The smartphone platform, the mobile platform, is the fastest growing component in terms of gaming. And one of the things that we know is that you could play these anywhere. So even in your bedroom while you're trying to go to sleep, you can actually play some of these games. So parents will often take away their children's computer to cut back on screen time, yet they'll often pull out their smartphones and use those. And this is just a shot of a gaming parlor from South Korea. South Korea, the Asian countries actually have a huge gaming problem. And you could see this gaming parlor is full of people, and it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with high-speed computers and very fancy equipment. So what do we know about problem gaming severity? Well, we know it's basically on a continuum. So there are some individuals who don't game at all. And then we have what we refer to as social, recreational, occasional gaming, and those who are at risk for a gaming problem. Those who are at risk for a gaming problem start showing some signs of having a problem, but haven't reached what psychologists like to call the clinical criteria for having a full-blown gaming disorder. And I'm going to share with you some of the ways to look for that, so that if you're concerned about your children or your adolescents, or even yourself, you're able to look at how these continuum actually work, and some of the scales that we use to assess whether or not an individual has a gaming disorder. Now, this is part of the parenting series, so I'm going to focus primarily on children and adolescents. But be aware that most adults also play games online. And it may be solitaire, or it may be some other games that I'll show you in a minute. What we know is that the largest percentage of people are actually in this category, the social, recreational, occasional gaming. And then there's a group that don't game at all. They're too busy doing other things, and they may be doing educational work on their computers or on their smartphones, or looking at email. And then we have at risk for a gaming problem. Again, they're showing some beginning signs of clinical issues. And finally, we have a group of people who have a severe gaming disorder. And many parents have real concerns about those individuals, their children who have a gaming disorder. Our center, which we have on the first slide, the website, which is youthgambling.com, we get calls at least 2 or 3 times a week from a parent who says, my child has a gaming problem, not necessarily a gambling problem. There are many genres of games. Here's just a couple of those games that you could see. And in the lower left-hand corner over here, you see a game called Fortnite. I'm going to talk a little bit about Fortnite because Fortnite is one of the fastest growing games internationally. You have games called Grand Theft Auto, Minecraft, and Candy Crush, which is still a very popular game. And this is Fortnite, and this is one of the things called Battle Royale. And I want you to, this is from their website, and look also here where you see it's free. It's free to download and for individuals to play. Now, if all these games are free, how are they making money? Well, let's look at that for a second. Fortnite by itself has over 250 million users worldwide. They have revenues in excess of $2.4 billion in 2018, and they do that by selling upgrades to their software and other merchandise that's closely related. Currently, there's a class action suit pending suggesting that these games are designed to make individuals addicted to the games, and a large number of young people are actually contributing to this $2.4 billion. And so there is a class action lawsuit that was one was started in Montreal, another was started in California. I want to talk about the health and well-being of our children. And I want to suggest to you from this particular slide is that we could take a biopsychosocial approach. I'm not going to go into all the details of this. You will have it again on your recorded version. But we're dealing with some biological issues, some genetic issues. We're dealing with psychological issues, and you can see those listed here on the right-hand side. But we also need to look at the social context, and that's really important. I'm going to come back to the social context as well when we look at how do we curb or curtail or limit or reduce the amount of gaming that our kids are engaged in. And I'm assuming that most of you have signed on to this particular workshop because you're concerned about your children gaming excessively, and I will go through some of the strategies and some resources that you might want to look at going forward. So let's look at gaming for a second. There are primarily two categories of gaming. One is what we call online gaming, where you're playing games on some technological apparatus, mostly your computer or your personal device, your iPad, or in terms of your smartphone. And these are played simultaneously by multiple players who are communicating with each other in real time. They're either cooperating or they're competing with one another. And then we have the offline games. And these are things like the Nintendo or the Sega or the Sony PlayStation, where they can be played alone. Some of them are hooked up to the internet and they can be played online as well. But there's usually a well-defined start and end to these games. Whereas the online gaming, there's often goes on and on and on and on. What we know is that online gamers actually spend more time playing games, and they report having online friends and report more satisfaction basically on their game. What we know also is that many of these children, when we get to the good, bad, and ugly part, become social isolates. And when you talk to these children, they will tell you, no, I have a friend. My friend, could you tell me about your friend? My friend lives in California, and we play every night together. Unfortunately, you can't go to a movie with your friend, even though we're in COVID now, and you can't go to a movie, period. But typically, these children wind up often becoming social isolated. They have lots of online friends, but they tend not to have many social friends. We also know that 70% of gamers prefer online games compared to offline games. So, a couple more facts. Since the 1990s, when video games first became popular, they become more technologically sophisticated, and the number of people playing these games have dramatically increased. The games are easily accessible via computers, tablets, game consoles, and smartphones. They're often free to download. There's a way in which the companies actually get you to purchase things, which I mentioned earlier. And today we have over 2 billion active gamers worldwide, and those numbers are growing exponentially. 97% of teenage boys play video games, 83% of teenage girls play video games, so it's not just a male-oriented activity. We know that 96% of adolescents and almost 92% of young adults have played some sort of video game. This comes from some research that was recently done in Ontario. 73% of adolescents and 62% of young adults have downloaded a free game on their mobile or computer. A third of adolescents have purchased a game as well. We know that excessive gaming has become one of the leading causes, actually, of college dropouts. And 48% of student gamers report gaming keeps them from studying. And 9% of those people actually tell you that's why they use gaming. So gaming becomes an alternative to doing educational work, doing your homework, sitting down, socializing with your parents, or interacting with friends. In a study that was done in Ontario by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, they did a study amongst high school students, and what they found was that when they extrapolated the data, 13% of the Ontario high school students, or approximately 123,000 children, have experienced some problems of a video game disorder, and that's dramatically up from 9% when the study was originally done in 2007. My best guess is if we did the study today, we'd find an even higher number. And we know that about 1 in 5 boys reported having problematic symptoms linked to their video gaming. Online gamers, much more likely to be problematic. And I'm going to come back to this next statement because this comes from the World Health Organization. But for a gaming disorder to be diagnosed as such, the behavior pattern must be of sufficient severity to result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, other important areas of functioning. So we're looking at the negative consequences of gaming, not just playing the gaming itself. However, playing the game for long periods of time often are accompanied by many of these impairments. And typically these should be evident for at least 12 months. Now, that has been modified in some jurisdictions, depending upon the social context involved. The worldwide estimates are that between 1 and 9% of gamers are at risk of an addiction. IGD, or internet gaming disorder, also correlates very highly with anxiety, 92%, depression, 89%, attention deficit hyperactive disorders, 85%, social phobias, and OCD, 75%. Social media and gaming can strengthen friendships, but it also can provide an emotional support system for many of our children. Gaming 30 hours a week has been associated with a gaming disorder. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes when we look at some of the characteristics. And while many games become free, individuals can use what we call microtransactions to purchase items or open loot boxes using real money to purchase keys with a chance to win virtual items. And once again, I want to touch on that in a few minutes. But why do people game excessively? Well, first thing we know is that gaming fulfills specific emotional, psychological needs. It can be an escape from school, an escape from parents harping on different activities or different behaviors that they're doing. There's a social connection associated with this because your friends are doing this. And it's an opportunity to be successful. So what we know is that many children who have difficulties in school or are experiencing academic problems can actually be quite proficient when they're gaming. And so it's a reinforcement of their success, which leads to higher self-esteem on some of these games. We know that games are intentionally designed to keep players engaged or hooked using behavioral psychology strategies. When gaming operators talk about what makes a good game, it's how many people that they can keep engaged on their game. Games are fully immersive. You get overly involved. When you're calling your son or daughter, they don't hear you because they're always immersed in the game. And it provides hyperstimulation or a dopamine release, and that rush that one gets is once again reinforcing. Gaming is a safe place to fail. So if you're not doing well, all you have to do is start all over again. Whereas real-world failures can be permanent. Gaming is a community and culture by itself, and relationships that they engage in are actually quite meaningful. But it may be their only relationships, which becomes problematic. And gaming is normalized and socially accepted, so that most of us realize that this is a reality. We can't do away with it. And so it becomes normalized behavior, especially amongst children, adolescents, and even young adults. I gave a talk to the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and I asked them how many of them were addicted to gaming on their smartphone, and everybody in the room actually raised their hand. So if we look at some of the good things, and Dr. Dubé actually talked quite a bit about some of the good things that can occur from gaming, because there are educational games, it provides a form of relaxation and distraction. Or another way of looking at it is in terms of stress reduction. It helps minimize loneliness and boredom. So when kids are bored or when adults are bored, it provides some opportunity for them to engage in something that may be constructive or at least entertaining. It's a great way to escape from reality, and because they're fully immersed in this, they tend not to deal with other issues that may be interfering with their gaming. It provides another venue for interaction so they can talk to their friends about what they're doing. It can provide employment opportunities, because many of today's young people, when you ask them what do you want to do when you grow up, they don't talk about being university professors or doctors or lawyers. They want to be gamers. They want to be bloggers around their games. They want to work for a gaming company developing games. It can be educational and provide learning opportunities. Again, Dr. Dubé talked quite a bit about that in terms of how to look for good apps and so forth. And you can maintain and improve social relationships. It's a way of staying connected. And once again, Dr. Tolwer talked about using smartphones and social media as a way of staying connected. It enables people to provide and receive social and emotional support from your peers. And it's an opportunity to meet new friends online and share with those friends. And certainly when you become good, and the more you practice, typically the better you get, it improves one's self-esteem. What looks so random in many of these different games, or in fact is not random at all. There are certain heuristics, certain underlying rules built into these games. And the more you play these games, the better you seem to be getting. And it also can enrich people's lives. It's another opportunity to learn about things. It's another opportunity to share or exercise one's judgment and looking at self-esteem, which can be improved as a result of one's gaming behaviors. But along with the good stuff comes some bad stuff. It can impede face-to-face interpersonal social interactions. You're too busy playing games. You don't necessarily have to use Zoom, where I can see the other person and chat with the other person. It can result in difficult family and peer relationships. And we know that this is often an opportunity or an event which causes tremendous discord amongst family members. I hear parents telling me all the time, I call my child up from the basement or from his room where he's playing a game, and then they don't come for dinner. I call back. I go into the room and I actually shut the game off, and my child starts screaming and becoming very agitated and often aggressive and says, I've never gotten this high in this game before, and now what you've done is you've actually shut me out of this game. It can interfere with educational employment responsibilities. So if a child would rather game than do his homework or her homework, we know that can impede or interfere with their education. We have a number of companies that have monitored very closely what employees are doing on their computers, because they're often wanting to play games. And we know that some colleges have now outlawed the use of laptop computers, because what they found was that college students were either doing email, looking at YouTube, chatting, or playing games. It can interfere with one's health. And again, eating, I use the example where children would rather skip dinner than actually stop their gaming. Certainly, you can't be exercising while you're gaming unless you're doing the Wii Fit. And it can interfere with one's sleep patterns and sleep behaviors. And so individuals become sleep deprived, and that impacts their overall physical health. We know that young people can become extremely aggressive and have aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Some of that is linked to the type of game they're playing, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And there's little transfer of learning from gaming to other academic tasks. When Nintendo first came out, I had a discussion with the CEO of Nintendo where he talked about all the positive things that children can learn. Their eye-hand coordination improves, that they can actually, on some of these fighter jet games, have a better eye-hand coordination and response time. And I asked them the question, how many of the people who are playing your game actually going to become jet fighter pilots? It is a major source of conflict between parents and children. There's little doubt about that. I would doubt that many of you who are listening tonight have never had a fight or discussion or have told your children to stop playing those games. And it can become costly. So those free or those microtransactions can add up fairly quickly. And it also may interfere with help-seeking behaviors on children's part. They may feel that screen time or games can actually improve whatever it is that you're asking them to improve. There's some major ugly pieces to the gaming, and it can become excessively, when it's excessive, it can result in an addiction. We often refer to these now as behavioral addictions. And I was on the World Health Organization's committee that actually decided to put it into their ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases, where it has now become officially recognized as a problem. It can result in increasing frequency, duration, and intensity. It can become the most important activity in the person's life, dominates his or her thinking, feelings, and behavior, results in unpleasant emotional, physical states when trying to cut down or stopping the behavior. They become very agitated, and it can result in neglect of other activities. It's difficult to game and be involved in one's social life and doing other hobbies or work, other interests, and other interpersonal relationships and school-related problems. So when is gaming too much? That's the question that parents want to ask all the time. Well, I think there are a number of factors to consider. Firstly, there's the age of the child. Then there's the context. If a child is playing 6 hours a day during the week when he's in school or she's in school, this can become a problem. Is it the same problem if they're playing 6 hours a day during Christmas recess? So I think we have to look at the context of what's happening. Is gaming resulting in some impairment or difficulty? Are children still doing really well in their school? Are they having no conduct disorders or no conduct problems? If it becomes impaired and there's difficulty, then it becomes problematic. Can children self-monitor and regulate their own behavior? Or do they need us as adults to help regulate the behavior? Dr. Tolwa last week talked about controlling one's modem in the house. And I had a family whose father actually locked up the modem in a closet and put it on a timer so that the child can only play a certain number of hours a day. Although today with smartphones, that becomes more problematic. Are there health-related concerns? So as a general rule, for most school-age children, we're suggesting that between 20 to 29 hours a week of gaming is really a red flag. If you're dealing with 30 or more hours a week, this is a real problem. Now, again, these are just general guidelines. Individual differences are important. What has happened during the pandemic? Well, we know that gaming has become the go-to entertainment for people in quarantine. 73% of growth in April of this year in revenues of $1.5 billion to the gaming industry. Fortnite by itself increased by 28 million players. There was a 46% increase in the US, 41% in France, 28% in the UK, and 23% increase in Germany. When we're at home, when we were in deep lockdown, where our children were not in school and we were all working from home, it's very difficult for us to work at home and still entertain our children. And so often we just sent them into another room and say, go on your computer, go on your iPad, go on your cell phone and play some of these games. Now we're trying to get them back off of those games. I want to suggest to you that gaming disorders do not exist in a vacuum. And in some ways, we could actually insert any of these different bubbles into the center. So we know that problem gaming also is associated with parental problems, anxiety, depression, conduct disorders, other mental health issues, and learning problems. Obviously, I don't have time to go into this slide, but it is one of the slides that Dr. Dubé has made available. This comes from some research that with one of my doctoral students, Jeremy Richard and Carolyn Temchef, one of our colleagues at McGill, where we looked at childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and adulthood to look at what are the precipitating factors for a gaming disorder, and then what are the consequences. So I will leave that to you for those of you who are interested who may want to refer back to that slide. There are other things that we need to look at in terms of the World Health Organization. I mentioned this earlier. We're looking at digital gaming or video gaming. And what the key here is the impaired control over the gaming, the priority given to gaming over other activities, where it takes precedence and their interests in daily activities, and there's an escalation despite the negative consequences. So in spite of individuals wanting to cut back, they will continue to do this, and it will actually increase. And the behavior pattern must be of sufficient severity to result in some significant impairment in either a personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And these have been evident for typically more than 12 months. The DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 by the American Psychiatric Association, talked about internet gaming disorder as a proposed criteria for the next revision of the DSM. But here you see what the categories are, which give individuals, if you identify with any of these or your child identifies with any of these different items, then they may have a internet gaming disorder, and it could be mild, moderate, or actually severe. And I'm not going to go through these slides, but again, these are slides that are attached to the presentation. But this is one of the scales that have been developed by Haley Pontus and Mark Griffiths, which identify gaming disorder. And it actually, it's called the IGD-9, the Internet Gaming Disorder 9 scale. And you will be able to see, let me go back. Okay, so these are the 9 questions, and you can look at these questions at your leisure and try to see if you think your child has a problem. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about that, about what are some of the precipitating factors, what are some of the indices to look for, what are some of the correlates of gaming disorder, let's look at how you as parents can help your children. Certainly there are a number of online help and support groups for parents, gamers, and professionals. There is something called Online Gamers Anonymous organization, which is like Gamblers Anonymous or Alcohol Anonymous, and you can go online and find these. Growing number of professionals are being trained to deal with youth gaming problems. And in China, South Korea, the US, and the UK, there are a number of specialty clinics which are inpatient treatment clinics for individuals with a gaming disorder. One of the questions I think we have to ask as parents, are we looking for harm reduction or harm minimization, or are we looking for total abstinence? And I would suggest to you that total abstinence is really very difficult to achieve. While we often get very frustrated, we'll pull the plug on the games, we'll shut off the modem, we'll take away our children's smartphones, ultimately they will go back. And what we're trying to do is find some way of looking at harm minimization, harm reduction. Traditional cognitive behavior therapy models have been used where we're trying to identify what some of the underlying causes are around gaming, and skill training, how we have an alternative use of time. Other strategies, don't call your child an addict or say they're addicted. This is confrontational, it's stigmatizing, and hurtful. You could talk about the behavior itself. I get very annoyed when you're on your games for long periods of time. Not like you don't listen to me, why can't you be like your brother and put the game away? Individuals often game to escape. And so what we want to know is, what are they trying to escape from? Academic difficulties, parental conflict, social and interpersonal problems. And Dr. Tolwa talked a little bit about this last week, parents as role models. If you're sitting there playing your games online, then it's become very difficult for children because they will often model our behaviors. As parents, we often have a great saying, do as I say, not as I do, but that doesn't always work. And understanding that lying and deception are fairly common. Time spent gaming, they'll often talk about how much time they spend gaming or the amount of money invested. And there's a greater need for unplugged time, and clearly parents have to have a responsibility in monitoring their children. When we talk to gaming operators, those people who develop these games, who offer these games to individuals, they will tell you when we question them and say, well, what are you actually doing to reduce the amount of time individuals are gaming? They will say, this is not our responsibility. This is the parent's responsibility. We want to track changes in behavior. So we don't expect children to go from playing 4 hours a day or 3 hours a day or 2 hours a day to 0 hours a day. And you can actually graph this, which shows children over time how they've actually decreased the amount of gaming they're doing. Understand that aggressive behavior, irritability are common when trying to cut back gaming. Children are not doing this necessarily because they want to get even with you, but they're actually doing this because they have difficulty controlling and monitoring their own behavior. We want to encourage social face-to-face activities with their siblings, with you as parents, with their peers. And we want to try to establish and maintain realistic rules. This is probably the key to parenting in general. Establishing the rules is not difficult. Maintaining those rules is much more difficult. Today we can say to children, you've had your limit on your game, and now you have to shut it off. And after lots of discussion, the child eventually shuts it off. The next day, we tend to say, shut it off, but we don't enforce those rules. So it becomes what psychologists like to call intermittent reinforcement. And that becomes problematic. Overall, for parenting in general, I would argue that patience is the key. We want to establish and maintain realistic rules, but we also have to be patient along the way. And we want to establish positive reinforcement. Thank you so much for coming back. Realize that you prefer to stay on these games for longer periods of time. Other strategies: identify the underlying causes, choose games together that you think would be acceptable to both you and the child. Adult supervision. Dr. Tolwa talked a little bit about family media plans last week. Having a positive family activity, which would dissuade children from gaming. It depends on the age of the child and what you're actually doing. And you want to review games and game ratings before you allow children to engage in these behaviors. And some of these are done through the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. And here you can see the ratings are in 3 parts. The different categories: content descriptors, interactive elements, and they're actually rated along a continuum here. And so that will help you determine whether or not children should be playing a specific game. More strategies: try to reduce the number of hours and days of gaming. I talked a little bit about abstinence or reduction. Encourage breaks in the game. Limiting access to less than 2 hours a day is certainly reasonable. Setting and maintaining those limits, and watching for signs for improvement. The key is to talk with the children and not at them. Understanding the psychological triggers, whether it be stress, anxiety, boredom, game-related events, such as new releases, advertising that they're bombarded with on their cell phones or online, invitations to friends' homes to play new games. And I think you have to watch for credit card charges, because many of these children are using microtransactions, don't have their own credit card, so they're using your credit card. And there are a number of web blockers. These are sites which will help block some of these online gaming sites. Number of resources. This is an excellent one for parents and teachers and for children as well. It's called gamequitters.com. It's developed by Cam Adair, who was a former compulsive gamer. And unfortunately, he was supposed to come to Montreal and give a general talk, but because of COVID, he wasn't able to get here. But hopefully we'll be able to bring him in sometime in the near future. There's another site that's very good called techaddictions.ca. And here's a book that was written on how to help children addicted to video games, a guide for parents, by Dr. Brent Conrad, who's a clinical psychologist. There's also, when in doubt, you can try to find some professional help. However, I will tell you that there are very few psychologists who have lots of expertise in gaming. But there are a number of other concerns that I want to mention before we throw it open for questions. And one is called Esports. For those of you not familiar with Esports, this is an example of the Staples Arena in Los Angeles, filled with people who are watching teams of gamers play against each other. So down here, you can actually see 2 teams who are playing a game and competing against each other for large prize money. Esports is one of the fastest growing activities. Colleges, believe it or not, are now starting to build arenas and developing college sports teams for e-gaming. And having sat on the International Olympic Committee, around gaming problems, the International Olympic Committee is considering putting on esports as an official Olympic event. Gambling as a vocation. Today we have many individuals who want to become professional players in esports. They want to blog about how to improve your gaming skills, and many of them want to become computer programmers to program for developing different games. There's also been a migration between gaming and gambling, and this is something that's a particular concern. I'll show you a couple of slides from different machines that are used. Here you see the Wii World Championship Poker, and you could see up here in the left-hand corner, 12 plus. This is designed for individuals who are 12 plus years. Here you have the Nintendo, once again for 12-year-olds, playing all kinds of Vegas gambling type casino games. And here the PlayStation, this must be really designed to teach younger children who are 3 and over how to play games. So even though some of these games have these markings on them and indications as to what is socially acceptable and for children at different ages, I think parents have to use their common sense when looking at these games. Many of these games are indicated for larger populations because they want to sell the game to larger groups of people. The last thing I want to suggest to you is that these are what are referred to as loot boxes. And these are embedded in many of the social games. And as a result, you pay money in order to try to win items which will help you actually in the game. So I tried to give you a very quick overview. As I mentioned earlier, many of the slides are going to be attached to the recorded part of this program. And I now am very happy to throw this open to questions. Okay, so the first question is, my kids look at YouTube, who game or record them. Is it the same impact on kids? Well, I think the amount of time that one plays the game or the amount of time one is looking at YouTube, it could be considered game playing. Many, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of bloggers who've made a lot of money playing or trying to give advice on YouTube as to how to improve games. And so that actually can be considered game playing as well. I limit another question. What if my child watches multiple gamers on YouTube? Do the same problems? I think I answered that earlier. This can actually become problematic. Another question says, I limit my children to only weekends, but they feel bad as all the friends at school play every day and talk about games every day. What should I do? I think, again, you have to use your own judgment here, but I would try to keep games for the weekend. And unless your child is finished with his homework or her homework and has a little bit of free time, and you might be able to limit the amount of time they're actually gaming. My teen is usually calm, but rages when gaming. How could I help them? I think one of the things that we have to do is discuss these issues with our children and give children the opportunity to either control their behavior or not to game any longer. Children, if you try to negotiate the amount of time that children are playing on these games, they will often try to exceed the amount of time that you are willing to give them. So one of the strategies I often use is, well, you have an hour to play the game, and they say, no, I need 2 hours or I need an hour and a half. And my response is, you can have 1 hour or no hours. It's your choice. You choose and decide what you would like. There's a 30 hours a week statistic from before COVID. My son is gaming more for social interaction. That 30 hours a week was based on research that has been done before COVID, but it's still fairly consistent. And yes, social interaction is important. You don't necessarily have to be gaming in order to engage in social interaction with your peers. There are a number of questions related to Fortnite, and certainly Fortnite is in fact very addictive. And they also hold tournaments where people can win lots and lots of money. Once again, it gives children a sense of self-esteem because the more they play these games, typically the better they get. Adults, on the other hand, when they play the game, don't necessarily improve as much as children. They learn where their underlying rules and ways in which they can actually compete. But one of the things that's important to differentiate are those educational games from those games that are more aggressive or more socially oriented. So if a child is learning how to do mathematics, as Dr. Dubé talked about earlier several weeks ago, then really that's very, very different. When we try to monitor our children's behavior, they often are very smart and know how to minimize their screens so that we don't know how much they're actually gaming. If we say we're going to shut your computer off or your iPad off, they will often say, go ahead, but then I can't do my homework. So it's really a difficult situation for parents. Many times we suggest keeping the computer in a common room where parents can easily modify it and monitor what's going on. Another question is when parents are strongly opposed to child playing a game, but the child claims everyone at school is playing, what would you recommend? I would say, I understand your feelings. I understand that many of your friends are playing this game. I understand that you would like to play this game, but right now you're not permitted to play the game. Let's look at some games in which we both can agree that you can play. So we give the children an alternative as opposed to saying, no, don't do this. No, don't do that. No, you can't play this game. Prevention techniques. The key for prevention is to set those limits, making reasonable limits, sometimes allowing children to break those limits. So, for example, we can have a different limit for the weekend, but maintaining those limits becomes more difficult. Games are often used today as the child's babysitter. It keeps them out of my hair while I'm trying to work or do other activities. But at the same time, when they're in school, we then want them to adhere to our rules. So it becomes very difficult for children to differentiate between when they could do their games and when they can't do their games. A number of questions have been asked around COVID. This is becoming a huge problem. Many parents have increased the amount of time that their children are able to play, and that's certainly reasonable. But they have to understand that now that they're back in school, with hopefully most of them are back in school. I know that some of the older high school children are now going every other day. So we may want to be able to increase the amount of time they can game on those particular days. But we also may want to look at other educational forms of games. So it's not just playing Fortnite or not just playing solitaire or casino type games like blackjack or slot machines. What would you suggest as reasonable time limits for adolescents, students, gamers? Again, you have to look at the context. It has to do with, are there harms being developed as a result of gaming? Some children need more time to complete the homework, to study. Other children need less time. But clearly, more than 2 hours a day can become problematic during school days. Maybe a little more on weekends if the child is actually able to not experience any negative related problems. Another one question relates to the YouTube gamers recording those in order to how to improve and help. Again, this is watching video games is almost like playing the video game. So the amount of time they're watching should be added or calculated in your addition of them actually playing games as well. So another question focuses on what should we do when kids don't follow the rules? Well, this is a difficult issue, and this is a difficult parenting issue. It's much more generalizable than just with respect to gaming. I would make the argument two things. One, let's try to use positive reinforcement and look at the positive things they're doing and minimizing the negative things they're doing. The second is how to talk with children as opposed to talking at children. And there's an excellent book, unfortunately, by a psychologist who passed away. His name is Chaim Ginott, Ginott, and he wrote a book called Between Parents and Children and another book called Between Parents and Teenagers. It's an excellent guide in terms of how to talk with children, how to help set rules, how to help maintain those rules. And the rules have to be realistic. And I think that becomes very, very important. How about managing kids of different ages in the household? That's you can have different rules for children who are of different age. That's no different than when you're setting sleep times for children or when they have to go to bed. Older children usually are able to stay up longer periods of time. So I would suggest that you can actually differentiate and cut back the number of hours that individuals can play games for younger children, while the older children, once again, with the caveat that it's not impeding or impairing any other problems, may be able to play some of these games a little longer. Are old school games like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong as addictive as modern games? If we opt for old school games or trivia games that encourage family interaction, are those better options over things like Candy Crush? Well, certainly the newer games are much more realistic. They have a much faster tempo and beat. They're played by a lot more young people, and so they're talking about these games amongst themselves. Fortnite is an action-oriented game. There's lots of manipulation in some of these games. The older games tend to be less addictive in general than some of the newer games that are available. We also know that girls tend to like different kinds of games than boys, and whether or not you want to discourage shoot 'em games with boys because it produces aggressivity is something that you might want to consider. What is the most amount of continuous time children between 12 and 15-year-olds should be playing video games? Once again, I think it has to do with the context. Is it during school break, during the Christmas holidays? Is it a holiday? Has the child done all his homework? Is the child succeeding in school? Getting children, just want to make an important point about homework. We'll often as parents say, you can't play a video game until your homework is done. And what children hear in that statement is, I have to get my homework done. Doesn't mean it has to be done correctly or accurately. It just means it has to be done. And so I think we have to be careful about just saying when your homework is completed, you can actually play these games. We'll often ask children to show us their homework so we could go over their mathematics homework or their written work in order to help ensure that they're doing this in a conscientious way. Otherwise, they're just rushing through homework in order to get through to the game. Many of us have difficulties as well. Our children come home from school before we get home from work. And as a result, it's very difficult for us to monitor their behavior when we're actually not there. As I mentioned earlier, the use of smartphones is also particularly problematic because they're walking around with a portable computer which actually can play lots and lots of games. A number of different high schools have found that it's been so difficult for high school students to have their phones because they're chatting online, looking at sites that they shouldn't be looking at, playing games, that they've asked children or adolescents, in particular in high schools, to deposit their cell phones in their locker, and they can only get their cell phones out at the end of the day after school is over. Every afternoon after homework, my son goes out with his friends and conquers new territories and vanquishes his enemies. These are all things he should be doing normally, so as long as he's getting enough physical activity, should I be worried? The answer is, once again, if there are negative consequences of excessive gaming, then that's the time to start getting worried. But setting limits before those negative consequences come about is really, really important. So if you can set those limits before, allow them to play with their friends, and there are no negative consequences. The problem is most young people have difficulty self-regulating themselves. I'm willing to agree to playing for a half an hour. Half an hour turns to 40 minutes, 40 minutes turns to 60 minutes. Parents start saying, but you said 30 minutes, but I've never gotten this high, says the child. Parents get frustrated, children get frustrated, and before you know it, there's confrontation between parents and children. When we're dealing with our children and there's a difficulty, our major goal is de-escalation. Unfortunately, some of our behaviors are so instinctive and instinctual that all we do is wind up increasing our difficulties with our children. And so before you get to that point, having these limits set, having these limits maintained becomes really important. My 8-year-old is playing Roblox and Minecraft, and I'm trying to limit the time for games. I'm simply putting interdiction because if not, she could play hours in a row, and she's not playing too much with toys. She prefers online games. I don't want to be too severe, but I really don't know how to better monitor that. Once again, games are interactive and lots of action in many of these games. It is not unusual for young people to want to play these games. They're totally immersed, as I mentioned earlier. They're getting lots of positive feedback, and they enjoy playing these games. They're very successful. For children who are not successful in other areas of their life, games can become one source of their positive reinforcement and success. And so it becomes important in order to try to limit and monitor that behavior. The same way you wouldn't want your child to be doing exercising all afternoon and all evening, we want to try to get a balance. And balance becomes the key to not only our children's development, but also our parenting skills. So one of the questions is, I talked about internet gaming disorder and showed some of the statistics that showed that it was related to anxiety, depression, and the question that's being asked is this causal? And there have not been many longitudinal research studies that actually show it's causal, but there are a number of studies that have shown a high correlation. So in other words, we don't necessarily know if the anxiety is actually causing the excessive gaming or the excessive gaming is causing the anxiety. We do know they're related. And so on a pragmatic basis, that's more important to know than if it's necessarily just causal. Children will develop anxiety and depression. There's differences between males and females. There's differences as children get older. And so one of the things we want to do is look at the mental health of our children as well, and whether or not the gaming can actually help some of the mental health indices, or actually is resulting in some of these games resulting in causality. With iPad, Xbox, phone, it's really hard to monitor and limit their use. I take Xbox away, they go on YouTube, and so on. What's my suggestion? You're absolutely correct. It is very, very difficult to monitor children's behavior. They're walking around with a mini computer that we've given them because we want to ensure that they're safe and can learn from some of these different screen devices that we have. The best thing is to try to look at some of the negative behaviors that seem to be being emitted by our children, or look at negative consequences. If we're starting to see academic performance decrease, if we're starting to see the fact that they don't want to go outside and play, or don't want to go outside or interact with their friends socially, but tend to do these things more online, this becomes something that I think we should be concerned about. When do we take the limits away? How old should the kid be? Probably when they're 40, we could start removing some of the limits. Believe it or not, there's been a number of marital discords because one partner is playing the games excessively and not interacting socially with their partner. Really, it becomes very difficult to look at when we take some of these limits away. The key, once again, is based on what we've developed with the World Health Organization. Is it impairing any of the child's or adolescents or even adults' social interaction, educational or vocational problems being induced as a result of excessive gaming? These are the key things to look at. And what we want to really do is try to get individuals to self-monitor their behavior. As children get older, as they mature, they tend to be able to self-monitor their behavior a little more. If an individual learns that he's at or she's at risk of losing their job because they're on their cell phone too much, then they will learn very quickly in how to reduce the number of hours. How to deal with children asking to buy things online while gaming. They ask for gaming money as a birthday gift. Very, very common. Very, very common. I think what we have to do here again is set limits and maintain those limits. If our child said, I want you to buy me or adolescent said, I'd like you to buy me a Ferrari, we as parents have no difficulty saying no. Sorry, you're not getting a new Ferrari or a new Mercedes. The same thing is true with children and adolescents. I think you want to be able to limit the amount that they have. Are they using their own allowance in order to purchase microtransactions and items on some of these games? But I would be very cautious in watching your credit card statements as they come about. The good news is most children, adolescents don't have credit cards, their own credit cards in their own name, but I think you have to be very, very careful in monitoring that behavior. Gnat is the last name of the person. Sorry, I may not have said that. His first name was Haim, Haim, and then the last name is Ginott. And you should be able to find his books on online, on eBay, or in a local bookstore like Chapters. Is frequently blinking and nose twitching a sign of too much screen time? Hard to tell. It may be that they actually need glasses. It's a difficult thing to tell why they're doing it. Are they anxious when they're playing the game? And if so, there may be the eye twitching is related to being anxious, or blinking, or twitching their nose. They may be trying to throw off an opponent that they're playing with in terms of the games as well. High schools now use iPads for education, so how to balance the screen time, which is close to 12 hours a day. Really difficult situation. Really difficult situation. Most children are using some form of screen in school. We as adults are glued to our screens, whether we're checking our email, doing Zoom meetings, or working online. It's becoming more and more difficult. I think what we want to try to do with our children is at least to encourage some breaks in their screen time and try to limit it. They shouldn't be, there's been some research suggesting that you should stop all screen time an hour before you go to bed, but that also becomes difficult to do. There are now computer screens that have blue light so that the less emission of radiation and also lights, so that enables people to go to sleep easier. It is not unusual for children and adults as well to sleep with their cell phone or their iPad right next to them in the bed. They're afraid of missing any communications between their peers or friends or playing certain games. Is anyone lobbying government to regulate game use as they do TVs or ads targeting children? There are a number of groups that have tried to do this. Once again, I showed you a picture of loot boxes where children are actually gambling or risking money in order to win prizes through their loot box. And a number of governments have now viewed that as gambling and have no longer permit gaming corporations from including those being embedded in their gaming, in the games that they're actually developing. The gaming associations will make the argument that we can self-monitor our behavior. And the truth of the matter is, I've had major disagreements with some of the larger gaming operators, and they have real difficulty self-monitoring their behavior. What they're looking for is to increase their usage, to increase the amount of microtransactions, because that's how they make their money. This is a multi-billion-dollar business. I didn't show you any graphs, but you would see a very sharp increase in the number of individuals gaming and the number of hours individuals are actually gaming. This is not just a North American problem or a Montreal problem. This is a worldwide problem, which is why the World Health Organization actually got involved as a professional organization in order to try to minimize the harms associated with gaming, and also to have it as a diagnostic criteria. That also has implications in jurisdictions for mental health insurance. And it would be very interesting to see what happens now that there's a lot more money being put into mental health in this province, whether or not any of this money can be used for parents who are seeking professional help for their children's gaming disorders. So one of the questions is, how do you recommend we approach the behavior even if it hasn't gotten to the true disorder stage? Will most teens tell their parents that they don't have a problem, that we have no idea? None of their friends have such interfering parents. Very typical. They will try to turn you against their friends and their friends' parents. Why are you so mean? I'm not having a problem. None of my friends have a problem. All my friends' parents, so let me do these things. We could be very cynical and say you should live with your friends' parents. Well, what we could say is, listen, these are the rules of the house. Let's try to come up with something that's reasonable between us and set those limits. And then I'm going to ask you, once we come with those limits, and I'm willing to compromise, then let's maintain those limits. So the child, if we say no time and the child says 2 hours and we compromise on an hour, I think it's important for us to show our children that we've actually compromised as well as they've been able to compromise. And we could differentiate that. You can say there's a different amount of time you could play these games on the weekends, on holidays, or if you're not going to school because you're only going every second day. Okay, well, I think I've kind of run down through most of the questions. I would suggest that if any of you would like to get some more professional opinions on this, I've written a number of different book chapters and professional papers that are available on my website, which is www.youthgambling.com. But we also have papers on gaming in there, and I've written a number of book chapters on the use of smartphones, how to limit the use of smartphones, and screen time. So I'd like to thank everyone for their participation and for coming. And I appreciate all the positive feedback that some of you have sent via the Zoom group chats. And I wish you luck and learn a little more about what your children are doing online. Learn a little more about some of the games, what makes them so interesting. And again, set and maintain limits, but be consistent. That's the key. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks to everyone for joining us in the series. It's the end of our series this year, so look out for it for next year as well. If you are interested in supporting the series at all, I'd like to take again the moment to thank the corporate sponsor, La Caisse des Jardins de l'Éducation, for supporting the series and enabling us to make it free for everybody. I put a link to the previous 2 talks in the chat for everybody. I also put a link to the donation page for the series. Money there goes to supporting this series, the department, other social initiatives, when we're allowed to have social initiatives again. And so thanks everyone again for joining us. I'm now going to go and log in and play online games with my brother, which I've done every Wednesday since I moved away from home in 2012. So, while I wait for him and I to wait for the PlayStation 5, which comes out next week. So I was paying rapt attention to Jeff's talk and assessing my own behavior. So thanks, Jeff. It was fantastic. Really appreciate it. And everyone take care.